They did not execute him. They did not exile him. They did not even condemn him. They simply built a new order, and in it, his name became unnecessary. Today, one of the most extraordinary generals of the French Revolution is barely a memory. Born enslaved, rose to command armies across Europe, feared by his enemies, and deemed inconvenient once power replaced principle. Empires choose their heroes. They carve their emperors into stone. But history isn't written in marble alone. It survives in what refuses to be erased. And some names do not disappear. Thomas-Alexandre Dumas de la Pailletterie was born on March 25, 1762, in Saint-Domingue, today Haiti. At the time, Saint-Domingue was the wealthiest colony in the French Empire. Sugar and coffee plantations produced immense profit. By the late 18th century, it supplied a staggering share of Europe's sugar. That wealth was generated by slavery. Mortality rates were brutal. Enslaved populations required constant replacement through the transatlantic trade because death rates exceeded birth rates. On some plantations, life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades. The legal framework for this system was the Code Noir, issued in 1685. It defined enslaved persons as property. It regulated punishment. It mandated Catholic baptism. It prohibited marriage between enslaved people and free whites. Most critically, it established that the legal condition of a child followed the mother. If the father is free and the mother a slave, the children shall be slaves. Thomas-Alexandre's mother, Reiss Dumas, was a slave. His father, Alexandre Antoine David de la Pailletterie, was a French nobleman. Under colonial law, only one of those identities determined his status. His mother's did. But how a French nobleman came to be raising children in slavery is a story of exile. Years earlier, Antoine had sailed to the colony to join his younger brother on a lucrative sugar estate. A violent feud tore them apart. Antoine vanished. For 30 years, he severed all contact with his aristocratic family, hiding under an assumed name on a struggling coffee plot. It was in this self-imposed exile that he purchased Marie Cécette Dumas. It was there she bore his children. Then, word arrived from France. His brother and father were dead. Back in Normandy, a vacant title, the Marquis de la Pailletterie, and an estate were suddenly his to inherit. Antoine decided to return and reclaim his nobility. But he was broke. He needed money for the transatlantic voyage. To finance his return to the aristocracy, he liquidated the family he had built in the shadows. He sold Marie Cécette. He sold their daughters, Jeanette and Marie Rose, to a baron from Nantes. In a single transaction, Thomas-Alexandre's mother and sisters were swallowed by the machinery of the colonial economy. In 1776, at age 14, his father had him sold in Saint-Domingue, with a clause allowing him to buy him back. It was a transaction written in the language of property. The sale generated funds for departure from the colony. But Antoine had not discarded his son completely. He had pawned him. He wanted his male heir by his side. Once Antoine arrived in Normandy and secured his newly inherited wealth, he executed the buyback clause. Later that year, Thomas-Alexandre crossed the Atlantic. His father paid the debt. He redeemed his son. He legally freed him. In Saint-Domingue, he had been property. In France, he was free. But France was still a monarchy. Status was inherited. Birth determined place. Freedom changed his legal condition. It did not erase the hierarchy he entered. He had crossed an ocean. He had not crossed the structure that defined him. For 10 years, Thomas-Alexandre was molded into a French nobleman. His father, now the Marquis, spared no expense. He provided a classical education. He bought him the finest clothes. He hired the elite fencing masters of Paris. Thomas-Alexandre learned to ride. He learned to shoot. he became a terrifyingly skilled swordsman. He was a wealthy, swashbuckling aristocrat in the capital of the world. Then, the money stopped. In 1786, his 72-year-old father married the family housekeeper. Thomas-Alexandre's lavish allowance was cut off. He was 24. He had to survive. He chose the military. But the French army was a hierarchy of blood and wealth. Without his father's financial backing, Thomas-Alexandre could not secure an officer's commission. He would have to enlist at the very bottom. As a private, the Marquis was furious. The idea of a Davy de la Pailletterie serving as a common soldier was a stain on the family honor. He demanded his son use a fake name to hide his identity. Thomas-Alexandre agreed to drop the title, but he didn't invent a name, he reclaimed one. On June 2, 1786, Thomas-Alexandre enlisted in the 6th Regiment of the Queen's Dragoons. He did not use the name Davy de la Pailletterie. He entered the army under his mother's surname, Dumas, and began as a common cavalryman. 13 days later, his father died. France at that time was still firmly a monarchy. Louis XVI ruled by inherited authority. Noble titles structured society. In the army, advancement was shaped less by merit than by birth and patronage. But the structure he entered was already under strain. For decades, the French crown had accumulated enormous debt. Costly participation in the 7 Years' War had weakened the treasury. Financial support for the American War of Independence, intended to weaken Britain, deepened the deficit. Court expenditures at Versailles compounded the burden. By the late 1780s, interest payments alone consumed a staggering portion of state revenue. Attempts at tax reform failed. Privileged estates resisted bearing greater financial responsibility. Grain shortages and poor harvests drove bread prices sharply upward. For ordinary families, subsistence became fragile. Public unrest grew more frequent. Confidence in the monarchy's ability to govern began to erode. In 1789, faced with fiscal collapse, Louis XVI summoned the Estates General to address the crisis. It had not met since 1614. Instead of restoring stability, the gathering exposed a deeper fracture. Representatives of the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly and claimed authority in the name of the nation. Sovereignty, they argued, resided not in the king, but in the people. On July 14, 1789, a Parisian crowd stormed the Bastille. The fortress held few prisoners and little strategic value. Its symbolic weight, however, was immense. The Bastille stood for the crown's power to imprison without appeal. Its fall demonstrated that royal authority could be physically challenged. Reform accelerated. Feudal privileges were dismantled. On June 19, 1790, noble titles were formally abolished. In legal terms, aristocratic distinction no longer carried official standing. For Dumas, that shift was not abstract. The hierarchy that had once elevated his father's name and excluded him from it was being dismantled in law. The revolution did not eliminate prejudice, but it weakened the legal architecture that had enforced inherited status. Across Europe, monarchies watched events in France with increasing alarm. In August 1791, Austria and Prussia issued the Declaration of Pillnitz, signaling concern for the fate of the French monarchy and hinting at possible intervention. Tension hardened into war. On April 20, 1792, France declared war on Austria. War immediately strained an already unsettled army. Aristocratic officers emigrated rather than serve a government dismantling their privilege. Others were removed under suspicion. Command structures thinned. Positions once guarded by lineage opened under pressure. The army Dumas had joined under a king was becoming something else. Not yet stable, not yet fully republican, but no longer insulated by inherited rank. Advancement began to depend less on ancestry and more on action. The old structure had not yet collapsed, but it was cracking. What would determine who rose next would not be a title. It would be performance. On August 10, 1792, Insurgents stormed the Tuileries Palace, the royal residence in Paris where King Louis XVI lived under guard after the revolution began. The assault ended what remained of royal authority. Within weeks, the monarchy was abolished. France declared itself a republic, in the middle of a war it was not yet prepared to win. The collapse of the crown did not bring stability. It intensified scrutiny. Foreign armies pressed at the borders. Early defeats deepened suspicion inside the country. The officer corps had already thinned as aristocratic commanders emigrated. Now suspicion cut deeper. Allegiance was tested. Failure in battle was treated as betrayal. The army was not merely reorganizing, it was being rebuilt under fire. The next day, August 11th, near Molde on the Belgian frontier, Thomas-Alexandre Dumas, still a cavalry corporal, led a mounted detachment against enemy forces. France had declared war only months earlier. The monarchy had collapsed the day before. Command structures were unstable. Trust was fragile. He did not command a regiment. He commanded a handful of horsemen. They captured 12 enemy soldiers. The number was not decisive in the scale of the war. The timing was. At a moment when officers were emigrating, when generals were suspected, when loyalty itself was in question, Dumas distinguished himself in action, not as a noble, not as a patron's son, but as a soldier trusted to lead. It was one of the first entries of his name in the military record. From that point forward, his advancement accelerated. By October 1792, he had risen to lieutenant colonel, commanding the cavalry of the Légion Française des Américains et du Midi, a unit that included free men of color. In the Royal Army only a few years earlier, rank at that level had depended largely on birth. Now it depended on performance, and Thomas-Alexandre's performance was terrifying. He was a physical titan, over 6 feet tall, impossibly strong, a master swordsman forged in the elite fencing schools of Paris. He was a cavalryman to his core. He did not command from a distant hill. He led from the bleeding edge of the vanguard. When he ordered a charge, he was the first to draw his saber. He was the first to hit the enemy lines. The French Revolution had stripped the army of its aristocratic officers. The new republic was paranoid. It was desperate. It demanded aggressive, highly visible heroism from its new commanders. Dumas delivered. His men followed him because he took the greatest physical risks. His superiors promoted him because his victories were absolute. In April 1793, the crisis deepened. General Charles-François Dumouriez, one of the Revolution's most celebrated commanders and the leader of the Army of the North, turned against the convention. After military setbacks and bitter political conflict in Paris, he opened negotiations with Austria and tried to pull the army with him. If he had succeeded, an entire field army could have been delivered to the enemy. The Republic was less than a year old. It might not have survived. Dumas was serving in the Northern Theater, inside Dumouriez's broader command structure. So, when Dumouriez turned, every officer around him faced the same question. Follow the general who had led them to victory, or remain loyal to a republic that might already be collapsing? Dumas chose the republic. At Lille, as Dumouriez's supporters tried to seize control for the coup, Saint-Georges and Dumas stood with the officers who resisted them. And while Dumouriez crossed into the enemy camp, Dumas remained with the army he had sworn to defend. The betrayal left the Army of the North shattered. Soldiers deserted. Units refused orders. Officers fled across the border. The Northern Front was exposed, shaken, and under suspicion. But for the representatives sent from Paris, the crisis revealed something else. The Republic did not simply need experienced commanders. It needed commanders who would not break. Dumas had proven his loyalty. Now he had to prove he could command. In the months that followed, he steadied frightened troops, imposed discipline, and held critical ground while the army struggled to recover. On July 30th, 1793, he was promoted to brigadier general. After that promotion, Dumas was charged with defending Pont-à-Marc, a vital position linking sections of the French army. On September 3, 1793, he became general of division. He was 31 years old. A general of division did not merely command a company or a regiment. He commanded a force large enough to maneuver on its own. Multiple brigades of infantry, often supported by cavalry and artillery. In battle, a division could shape the direction of an entire campaign. Its commander made decisions that affected thousands of lives at once. In 18th century Europe, that level of authority was usually tied to aristocratic lineage. Advancement depended on birth, patronage, reputation, and old networks of influence. Dumas had entered the army as a private in 1786. 7 years later, he was commanding divisions in the Army of the Republic. The revolution had declared equality. In his case, it had acted on it. What began in 1792 as a conflict with Austria widened into the War of the First Coalition. France now faced Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, and other monarchies determined to contain the revolution before it spread further. The war spread across frontiers, along the Rhine, through the Alpine passes, and into northern Italy. For the Republic, Italy was not a side theater. Austrian power rested heavily there. Lombardy was under Habsburg control, and the mountain corridors through the Alps and Tyrol linked the Italian front to the wider Austrian war effort. To secure France's southeastern frontier and weaken Austria's position in the coalition, the Republic pushed south and east. For Dumas, that expansion carried him into a different kind of war. The Alps were not forgiving terrain. Movement narrowed into stone corridors. Supply lines wound through steep passes. Artillery could stall in a single choke point. A retreat could become a rout if the geography turned against it. Dumas had already commanded in the Army of the Alps. By 1797, he was serving in the Alpine and Italian theater as French forces pressed Austria through the mountains. On March 23, 1797, French forces confronted Austrian troops near Klausen in the Tyrol, where the valley narrowed around the Isaac River. The crossing mattered. In that terrain, a bridge was not just a bridge. It was the road forward, the line of retreat, and the point where an army could be stopped. In open country, cavalry depended on speed. At Klausen, the mountains took that away. The gorge compressed the fight into a narrow space where physical presence and nerve mattered more than maneuver. Accounts of the engagement hold that Dumas used the choke point to halt Austrian troops long enough for the French position to stabilize. It was not spectacle. It was resistance under pressure. The scene invited an ancient comparison. In Roman legend, Horatius Cocles stood alone at the Sublician Bridge while Rome's enemies advanced, holding the crossing long enough for his countrymen to destroy it behind him. French accounts later placed Dumas beside that figure. To compare him to Horatius was not casual praise. It cast Dumas as the defender at the threshold, the man whose stand bought time, preserved an army, and turned a narrow bridge into the stage of national survival. The crossing at Klausen became part of his legend. Austrian soldiers, however, were said to have called him something else. Der schwarze Teufel, the Black Devil. Whether repeated as insult, fear, or legend, the name captured how his enemies saw him. Formidable in battle, visibly different from the officers they expected to face, and impossible to dismiss. Dumas was no longer rising through vacancy alone. He had secured a reputation. In 1798, he joined Napoleon Bonaparte's expedition to Egypt as a senior cavalry commander in the Army of the Orient. The campaign aimed to weaken British trade routes and extend French influence into the eastern Mediterranean. It was strategic, but it was also enormous in ambition. The army marched far from France. Supplies thinned, disease spread, distance stretched authority. And in Egypt, distance also revealed character. Bonaparte's control over the expedition was sweeping. Dumas did not move easily inside that structure. He objected to looting, corruption, and the growing sense that military necessity was being blurred with personal ambition. Later memoir tradition preserves sharp exchanges between the two men. Whatever the precise words, the alignment had fractured. In February 1799, Dumas secured permission to return to France and departed Egypt as a senior general. But the Mediterranean did not allow him to return quietly. His vessel never reached France. Forced into Taranto, a port in the Kingdom of Naples, Dumas entered enemy territory at the worst possible moment. Naples was a Bourbon monarchy aligned against revolutionary France. Dumas was recognized not as a traveler and not as a neutral officer in transit, but as a French general. He was arrested. In 1799, he entered a Neapolitan prison as an enemy of the state. There was no swift exchange of prisoners, no immediate diplomatic resolution. While Dumas was locked away in Taranto, France moved without him. His wife petitioned for help. The government knew he was imprisoned, but the Republic was stretched thin, fighting foreign armies on multiple fronts while political instability consumed Paris. Then, in November 1799, France altered its course. Napoleon Bonaparte overthrew the Directory and established himself as first consul. The Republic did not formally end, but power consolidated rapidly in one man's hands. Weeks turned into months. Months lengthened into nearly 2 years. In the spring of 1801, Dumas was finally released from prison. He was no longer the figure his enemies had feared. Confinement had ruined the body that once made him terrifying on the battlefield. Accounts describe chronic stomach pain, persistent weakness, damaged hearing, impaired vision, and partial paralysis. The imposing physical presence that once defined him in battle had been stripped from him. He returned to France alive, but not restored, not celebrated, and not returned to command. There was no homecoming befitting der Schwarze Teufel, the Black Devil. He returned in a different body, to a different country. He petitioned the government for back pay, pension support, and restoration to service. Assistance came slowly. Command did not return. In 1802, as Napoleon reshaped the state, a new order of recognition was established. On May 19th, the Legion of Honor was founded to formalize distinction in military and civil service. Many veterans of the Revolutionary Wars entered the new hierarchy. Dumas did not. The next day, on May 20th, the consulate enacted legislation restoring and maintaining slavery in key French colonies, a legal reversal of the revolutionary abolition that had once reshaped the empire's racial order. One measure rewarded service. The other narrowed freedom. Dumas stood outside both. That year, Thomas-Alexandre Dumas retired from military service. The republic that had accelerated his rise no longer existed in its original form. The system that had briefly rewarded performance over lineage had consolidated into something more controlled, more hierarchical, and less open to men like him. He had risen in a moment of rupture. He now lived in a moment of closure. On December 2, 1804, inside Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of the French. He did not wait for the Pope to place the crown upon his head. He lifted it himself. 15 years earlier, France had stormed a fortress in the name of liberty. It had dismantled feudal privilege, abolished noble titles, and declared that rank would no longer descend through blood. Now, a crown returned to the center of French power. But this was not the old monarchy restored. It was a new empire built from the revolution's wreckage. Its heroes were named carefully. Marshals were elevated. Victories became titles. Service became ceremony. Loyalty became rank. Thomas-Alexandre Dumas was absent from that ceremony. The man who had risen farther than almost anyone the revolution had made possible did not enter the empire's pantheon. He had held Alpine crossings. He had commanded cavalry in Egypt. He had served the Republic when its survival was uncertain. But the new order did not preserve him. On February 26, 1806, Dumas died. He was 43 years old. He left behind a wife and children whose security remained uncertain. His widow would continue petitioning for support. His children would inherit no imperial privilege. Only debt, memory, and a name. The empire celebrated its marshals. Dumas was not among them. The revolution had broken the structure of birth. The empire rebuilt structure around service, loyalty, and consolidation. In the narrow opening between those two systems, Dumas had risen. What the state failed to preserve would pass into another kind of legacy, not through imperial honor, through his son. He was not yet 4 years old when his father died. He did not know Thomas-Alexandre Dumas as a commander in the field. He knew him through absence, through household memory, through the stories his mother, Marie-Louise Labouré, kept alive after the state had turned away. Years later, Alexandre Dumas, the writer, would return to that memory in his memoirs. "I worshipped my father," he wrote. The sentence was not casual admiration. It was devotion to a man who had become larger in absence than he had been allowed to remain in life. The empire had not preserved Thomas-Alexandre Dumas in its highest honors. It did not make him one of its marshals. It did not secure his family's future. But his son remembered him, and memory became material. Alexandre Dumas would become one of France's most widely read novelists. In The Count of Monte Cristo, the wound of unjust imprisonment becomes fiction, not as biography, but as inheritance transformed. A man is buried by power, survives confinement, and returns changed. In The Three Musketeers, loyalty, honor, courage, and reputation become the architecture of identity. These were works of imagination, but imagination does not come from nowhere. Behind the adventure was an inheritance, a father born into a world that did not expect him to rise, a young man who entered the army without title, patronage, or aristocratic protection, a soldier who advanced by ability, an officer who chose the Republic when others betrayed it, a general who held mountain crossings, commanded cavalry, and became a legend to the enemies who faced him. A man Austrian soldiers called Der Schwarze Teufel, the Black Devil. A prisoner who survived confinement, but returned to France broken by it. A man the empire did not raise into marble, did not secure with honors, and did not preserve within its official memory. But history is not kept by power alone. Alexandre Dumas fixed his father into something more enduring. Not as a monument, as memory, as character, as the hidden force behind stories of loyalty, imprisonment, revenge, courage, and impossible return. Der Schwarze Teufel. Thomas-Alexandre Dumas, the exception.
Thank you for watching. If you'd like to see more stories like this, told with care, grounded in history, and brought to life through image and narrative, consider subscribing. And if you want to go further, to help support the creation of these films and keep these stories alive, you can support the channel on Patreon.